Rob won't be here today because he's at First Penance at Transfiguration, so we can talk about him.
Is it funeral?
At 11:30.
Oh, 11:30.
Yeah. And you know, I was going to suggest that we come here, but then I didn't think we could video it. But Jeff is doing a good job.
So it is being videoed.
So watch yourself, Michael.
Yes, I know. I always try to get a camera.
Make sure you introduce yourself before you say it.
Well, I'll wait for Jeff to make sure.
The makeup artist will be in a few minutes.
The makeup, that's what I
So we'll be ready.
Where am I? I should have worn my black wig.
Oh my God.
It's a little sentence.
Jeff is.
Speak it.
You want me to go out and start that way?
Well, she's done a podcast.
Jeff, are you around?
It's a little different.
No, it's How was it?
It was,
Oh, see, I knew that was gonna happen.
my phone videotaped.
That's right. She's convinced it is.
I have 2 hours.
It's not.
But you know, we weren't supposed to take it. But person to person can, right?
I believe so. Nobody came to me and said,
Not yet, anyway.
nobody told me that's considered the same. So I can show you.
Yeah.
Can I start? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming back. Those who couldn't come last week, we're very grateful to have you. Jeff tells me we had 89 watching last week. That means 89 computers. And I know that I want to extend a special welcome to our folks online and to my Sisters of Mercy. A whole group watched. Awesome. And I was at Mercy the other day and then somebody came up and said, I really enjoyed that. And I thought they never could get out for something like this. And I was delighted. All right. This is like, I was thinking to myself, here comes somebody. This is like a wonderful service that St. Catherine's makes available to not just the parish community. Good morning, come on in, honey. Not just to the parish community, but to the wider community. Good morning. Good morning. So I would like to begin our session today with the first reading you will hear either tonight or tomorrow at Mass, and it's from our new friend Isaiah. And I'd just like to hear your reactions to the reading. This is from the 61st chapter of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me, has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and the release to prisoners, to announce a year of favor from the Lord and a day of vindication by our God. I rejoice heartily in the Lord. In my God is the joy of my soul. For God has clothed me with the robe of salvation and wrapped me in a mantle of justice, like a bridegroom adorned with a diadem. Morning, like a bride bedecked with her jewels. As the earth brings forth its plants and a garden makes its growth spring up, so will the Lord God make justice and praise spring up from all the nations. The word of the Lord. What did you hear? A year of favor. A year of favor. And don't repeat it. Is there anything else you heard?
Well, this is when they return from captivity, right?
Right,
Isn't that what-
right.
So he was speaking to them as though they just come out of prison.
Exactly. This is the third Isaiah, and they're back from captivity. And the line that caught me, and maybe it's because of the news of the day, when he starts out, comfort, give comfort to my people. And I said to myself, the whole world needs it right now. Give comfort to my people. Why is this such an appropriate reading for Advent? What do you think? Sue?
Well, it's the waiting game. You know, we're all waiting for something.
Right.
And I think Isaiah is saying, to me at least, hang in there. It's coming.
It's coming. And you know, it's hard to, thank you, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to be in exile from everything you know for decades.
The wedding you mentioned, the bridegroom, the bride.
Yes.
It's a promise, like we make to one another. And
Yeah.
it's a promise that things are going to be better.
It's a promise that things are going to be better. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. It's a promise that things are going to be better. And he is, good morning, and he's sort of saying, this promise, a voice cries out, make straight the wasteland a highway for our God. What did the church see in here? Good morning. What did the church see in here? When we read, every mountain shall be made low, the rugged shall be made plain.
The coming of the Messiah.
The coming of the Messiah, John the Baptist.
That's what I was thinking of, John.
The early church looked here and said, he's pointing to John the Baptist. Now maybe Isaiah didn't mean that at that time, but he was pointing to a better days for the people.
And, you know,
So
when you're desperate, waiting for something, any little tidbit is an encouragement. Hang in there. We can do this together.
exactly. And I think for us as Christians, or for just the human family, every time we can do a little tidbit for somebody, we can make or break a day for somebody. But Isaiah had, the way he spoke, speak tenderly to Jerusalem. And her service is at hand. Her guilt is expiated. In other words, you've gone through a lot, and I'm bringing you back home. That doesn't mean their troubles are over. Doesn't mean that at all. Well, let me ask you, if during the week you had any new insights from our lecture last week about Isaiah. You're smiling, Sue.
I wish I had thought about it.
Well, you're busy doing justice. Any insights about last week, the context or the message of Isaiah?
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned about the three Isaiahs. And, that was a highlight to me, just in the background.
That there were three Isaiahs. Three Isaiahs. The name must have meant something for the other two to take it. But this one is really reflecting on what happened and the joy of returning.
700 years, just seems, it's amazing. You said it was written 700 years before Christ.
Right.
Like, wow.
Wow.
It's just such a long time.
It is.
It's amazing.
Such a long time, 700 years. And it shows us in this day and age when we have to admit that anti-Semitic feelings are on the increase, that these are our roots. I told you the story one time about a sister told me she had a terrible time in religious education. Can you hear me? Thank you. She had a terrible time in religious education. And I said, well, what went wrong? She said, I had such a hard time, this was when I was in Washington, trying to get the people to accept the fact that Jesus was Jewish. And finally, hi, sweetheart, and finally, this guy comes up to her and says, okay, sister, I'll accept it, but not Mary. And I'm saying, okay. I had a hard day too. But I think that opening line, comfort, give comfort to my people, is the message that we desperately need today. No matter what you think of, well, Hamas is evil, but the poor Palestinians and the Jews and the descendants all need comfort, and so do we. As a nation, we need comfort. Well, today we're going to begin a discussion of the gospel chosen for this year B in the lectionary, the Gospel of Mark. I have a great story to tell you. Before, I was older when I joined the community. People used to say you weren't generous with your youth. But I had more fun. When I joined the community, I taught right away at Mercy High School as Sister Barbara, and then this is before Vatican II. And then we chose a name, or were given a name, and some of them were really doozies. And I desperately wanted the name Mark. And we had a sister years ago who died very young with the name Mark, and the president was a little reluctant to give it out to a newcomer. And her family said, oh, do it. So I got the name Mark, and I loved it. Thus, I love the Gospel of Mark. So when I went to teach at Colgate, I was Barbara, Sister Barbara, and they had hired this new guy from England, Mark Brummett, to teach Old Testament. And he was a raging character. I mentioned to you, he'd come in with shoes with the Blessed Mother on each picture. So one time I said, it's interesting, Mark, because that was my name years ago. I was Sister Mark. And he said, well, you know, I'm a nurse, and in England, I was Sister Mark. So he said, we got two on this floor. And I still hear from him, he's back in London. So today I want to discuss with you why we have four Gospels. Can you hear me okay now, honey? Why we have four Gospels. And scholars over 2,000 years have discovered many written works that have been called and are called Gospels, epistles, acts of something, and letters. And all of them deal with the ministry and life of Jesus. There are so many of them. There are several books. I was going to bring a couple of books, but it got too heavy. But some of the ones that many Christians think are authentic. The first one is the most significant. You've heard of the Gospel of Thomas. That many Christians think that should be in the official list. Gospel of Bartholomew. There's a Gospel of Judas. There's a Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And when you read it, it's short. They only have a couple of little chapters. And in the Gospel, she is waxing eloquent about what Jesus taught her. And Peter gets miffed and says something to her, and the other disciples said, stop, don't you know she was a special friend of his? And I thought, there it is. It was there from the early days. Maybe that gospel is why they didn't make it in the official list. So in order to sort of get a sense of why we have four Gospels, we need, I believe, to think about the power of the oral story and the lack of literacy at the time when these Gospels were written and Jesus lived. There are writings that have been held sacred and were preserved from different apostolic circles and cultures. And in the Roman Church, we speak about the canon. Not that we're big shots. Did you get it? But the word canon means authentic. So some say that maybe 60 years after the death of Jesus, that some leaders were gathering around certain documents that they felt were authentic. But it wasn't until the 4th century that the present 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the letters of Paul, and other letters became the official canon of the Roman Church. And when the Reformation came, more changes were made. For example, Luther could not stand the letter to James, because it says, faith without works is dead. But all he could see were the works that the church was demanding. So he didn't like the letter to James. But by the Reformation, the 16th century, the final canon of the Roman Church was accepted. But there are differences among Christians. When you open your Bible, you can see that. And so I say to myself, why is it that Matthew gets so much prominence? Whenever we say the 4 Gospels, we start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's just interesting. Maybe it's his length, the length of the document, but Mark is the earliest of all of them. Mark dates to the mid-60s. That's some 30 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now just think about that. My mother died in 1960. Think of what has happened in my life since then. It's amazing. When we think Mark was written in the 60s, that's 30 years after the death and resurrection. A generation has come and gone, and people have joined the community. Mark's gospel is the shortest, and some believe it is the closest to the eyewitnesses of Jesus. What have I done? Change the mic. Does it change the appearance of the speaker? Make him more intelligent. Whoa. All right, thank you. All right. Luke and Matthew could be accused. Luke and Matthew,
she said.
good, could, near my mouth, which is my problem. Luke and Matthew drew on Mark. And I brought a book today to show you that. This book up in front, and I'll leave it so you can look at it, is called The Gospel Parallels. And the first edition came out in the 70s, and it took the whole story of Jesus from his birth to resurrection, and it compares how the 3 dealt with it. And then later, in the 80s, they added John, who's very different. Now, one side of the book is Greek. I don't even go there. The other side is in English, and it shows you the differences and the ways in which Matthew and Luke, I don't want to say plagiarized, but used Mark. It's a great resource. So now I'd like to share with you the context from which Mark wrote his gospel like we did last week with Isaiah. And I said to myself, what will people write about us 30 years from now? And I thought, oh my, they'll write about violence. Just the other day, 2 more gun attacks. They'll write about our environment suffering and the efforts we're trying to make to help it. They'll write about the wars that are going on in our lifetime. I remember Pearl Harbor like it was yesterday. Wars that continue to go on, and the progress we have made. It's interesting, research has shown us much more about the Civil War that we didn't know. John Meacham's book, The Soul of the Nation, is so good. More about World War I than we never knew. More about World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And so conflicts have been exposed because of new inventions, because of letters, because of science. Rachel Maddow has a new book out called Prequel. And the book discusses the growth of fascism in our country before World War II. And she shows how fascism was really growing, and one of the great leaders of fascism here was Henry Ford. And people don't know that. Hitler had a picture of him in his office. So there's so much in history that we don't know or understand. But the one thing we do know and helps us to understand Mark is that always in the background of Mark is the Empire of Rome. The Empire of Rome. What from your days in the past do you remember about the Empire of Rome? And I'll repeat it, so what do you remember?
Persecution of the Christians.
Persecution of the Christians. Any?
Slavery.
They had slaves, yes they did.
Its size.
Its size. If anybody has been to Europe and seen the Mediterranean Sea, they controlled land north to England, Spain, around all of North Africa, over to the Middle East and to Turkey. That is big. That is big.
And some of their structures are still there.
Some of the structures are still there. The Roman Forum, the catacombs, remember? Yeah, yes.
Speaking of structure, their organizational structure is unparalleled.
They're-
To be able to manage
That's right.
cross continents is unbelievable.
Their organizational structure, they were able to manage. And when they conquered, say, England, or wherever, they were quite respectful of the local culture, which was unusual. And they allowed the local culture to thrive until or unless they faced pushback. It was progressive, but very violent, could be. Citizenship was a jewel. Remember, Paul was a Roman citizen, and that saved him from some serious trouble and allowed him to be taken to Rome for his trial. Citizenship was a prime quality. They allowed people to maintain their customs as long as it didn't interfere with Roman power. Remember, if you ever watch PBS, they did a whole series on Hadrian's Wall in England. An amazing construction. Their roads, their literature, their art, their construction, yes.
Yeah, they're aqueducts.
Their aqueducts, their temples, just amazing. And their understanding of polytheism. They had their gods, but they were cruel. There was one story I remember in an ancient history class that almost dropped made me drop dead. A whole group of people were found guilty of a crime, and they were crucified. That was the worst punishment. Crucified and then lined up, like coming into St. Catherine's on either side of the parking lot and set on fire. Think about that cruelty.
It's almost like a blueprint for the Nazis.
In a sense, they offered a blueprint for regimes to come. They were powerfully and beautifully constructed, but they had their very dark side. At one point, Rome was a republic, and then gradually power shifted into one, and we have the Roman emperors. And you remember the great story about Nero. We say he fiddled while Rome burned, but he found a way to blame that on the Christians. Whereas many historians feel he did it himself because he wanted some new construction. Any opposition to the emperor was met with serious consequences. Remember the text, I think in Matthew's gospel, when they tried to test Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Well, you see, the coin had the emperor's image on it, and to hold one for a Jew meant they were worshiping an idol. But many of the Jews paid the taxes. The emperor was called the Prince of Peace and the Son of God. So you can see in that context how conflict would grow between the new Christians, whether Jewish or Gentile, and Rome. And the Christians became a threat. And we know that Peter and Paul went to Rome. And they both were martyred there. And that also is a background for the Gospel of Mark. So it wasn't until the 300s that Constantine legalized the Christian church. I don't think so much for faith, but for power. And the church then began to just blossom. But Peter and Paul were both executed in Rome. And that importance, that context is so important because it stands behind Mark's gospel, which was written in Rome. How do you think it might affect the gospel of Mark? What do you think? What do you think Mark might have been doing in light of this context?
Well, he wasn't challenging the authority.
He wasn't challenging the authority.
He had to be careful.
He had to be very careful.
I try to increase my use of metaphors,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
come at things obliquely from instead of directly.
Yep.
He was making connections.
He's making connections, and it's like Isaiah's comfort, oh comfort my. Oh, excuse me.
Wow.
It's like the Pope calling. Have a couple words for me. I'll get back. He was trying to say to the Christians, comfort. I'll bring comfort to you through explaining who this Jesus was. So the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome. Some wonder, there's a fellow that pops up in the Acts of the Apostles called John Mark. And some wonder if he's the one. Paul sort of dumped him along the way, but we don't have any record of that. Mark was a Jew writing for Jews and Gentile Christians in Greek. And what he was facing was a growing Christian community that was surrounded by a powerful pagan state and an atmosphere of persecution. Now in the 60s, when Mark was writing, Peter and Paul were both executed. Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded. Now think of the impact that had on the community. And here we have the Gospel of Mark trying to give strength to the people as they were living their faith. It's the shortest gospel. It skips the infancy narratives, and it's really hard to use in Advent. Because the first reading last week was the end times. It was hard to use. Mark goes directly in the opening to the ministry of Jesus. And when you read Mark, maybe that's why I like him, because he's always on the move. And he's using words like, well, immediately I left here and went there. Something happens, it's real, he's real. And the question is, why did he avoid the birth of Jesus? Why do you think he jumped right into the ministry of Jesus?
Is he trying to avoid the whole Son of God comparison that the emperor was having?
That could be a very logical reason, maybe trying to avoid conflict. Sue?
I think he thought it had been done. And he needed to go in a different direction.
He needed to go in a different direction. That's interesting. He thought it had been done, and he needed to go in a different direction. He questioned, he raises issues around the ministry and the resurrection of Jesus. And you know what I think? You know, we've all been in love one time or another. Isn't that true? We have. And when you fall in love with someone, all that matters is the present moment. And then when you're thinking, will this person be a good life companion? Then you begin to ask more questions. Tell me about your family. And hope they're not on the 10 most wanted list. Tell me about where you were born, etc., etc. By the time Mark had finished his gospel or was writing it, there were rumors that Jesus was illegitimate. That he was illegitimate. And that's why I think he started right out with what was the most important to the community, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But as time went on, the other gospel writers realized they need to talk more about the infancy of this child. I'm going to read the gospel for this weekend from Mark, and see what you think of it. Sunday. Okay. Here's what Mark will hear this weekend from the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. In the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What do you see in that statement?
In the beginning, he's saying right in the beginning, he's skipping a whole lot.
He's skipping a lot, and he's making a definite statement right in the beginning. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. No dodging the question. He's laying it right out in the beginning. And then he goes on to say, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, there's our boyfriend again. And Isaiah writes, behold, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way, a voice of one crying out in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight God's paths. Mark goes right to Isaiah, and then he says, John the Baptist appeared in the desert. And that links right to our first reading. It's fascinating. It shows you the importance of Isaiah, but he goes right to John the Baptist appeared in the desert, proclaiming a baptism of repentance and the forgiveness of sins. The people of the whole Judean countryside and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the Jordan River, and they acknowledged their sins. John was clothed in camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. He fed on locusts and wild honey, and this is what he proclaimed. One mightier than I is coming after me, and I am not worthy to stoop and loosen the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Right off the bat, he lays out the agenda. Right off the bat. It's just fascinating. I was at a period of time in my life when I said, we shouldn't give Isaiah so much credit. He was maybe speaking to his own day and time, and he was. But the early church, Jewish, looked back and saw in those words what came to fruition. What do you think?
It must have given them a lot of hope in that time, 30 years after Christ's death, being persecuted in Rome, having two of their leaders be martyred, to have Isaiah almost as a role model, to be patient, to, hang in there.
Hang in there. That's a good, it must have been encouraging to them. Hang in there. Barb, did you want to? No, okay. Anybody else? Sue? No?
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
And wouldn't Isaiah have been a sacred text for the Jewish?
Oh, absolutely. And you remember the time Jesus launched his public ministry and he went into the synagogue and they handed him only men he must have been able to read or he knew it by heart. And they opened the text to Isaiah and he reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor and sight to the blind." Closes the book and says to the crowd, "It's being fulfilled in your presence." Well, they must have gone crazy. In fact, they tell us they wanted to kill him. So, a sacred text, to be sure. Anything else?
Barbara, I'm quoting from Mark and things, and I have this little picture in my mind. I can't remember what Holy Week, it finally dawned on me with that little statement toward the end of the scene of the crucifixion. Well, actually, it was, I think, the rest of Jesus. And there's a sentence or two, and I know this is true because I was there, basically. He refers to, the writer refers to the person the gospel is named after, Mark, as having been there. And a young, what was it? It was a young boy, like
Ran away naked.
Running away from the scene, yeah.
Yeah.
And it just, because all as we're going through, you and I were joking about, we need to use the pronoun they. We need to use the pronoun they when you're talking about any of the scriptures, because it wasn't one person with a no.
That's right.
And so, and from storytelling, as much as writing, maybe more. So it just is fascinating.
It's fascinating. We don't live so much in an oral community.
No.
We tell family stories. And probably in the telling of the stories, things shifted, depending on the audience. And as we've said before, when we talked about parables, that was a form of teaching. And Jesus would start with the parable. We read it today, and the parable, say, of the shepherd, the good shepherd, and we got it done in a minute and a half. It might take a full morning or a day for him to tell a full parable. because they'd interrupt him and say, well, what did you mean? My brother's a shepherd, he never did that. And so, oral life, yeah. And it's believed that Mark saw himself as Peter's voice. He saw himself as Peter's voice. Well, Peter and Paul were there. I don't know if he engaged him, but he's bringing all his history and experience to the text.
What you're talking about too is a point of view. That's how you kind of started out today, with point of view.
Point of view.
Yes, and so when I taught 5th grade, there's this little guy in my class who was just a whippersnapper. Oh, he was so smart.
What class was this, Sue?
This is 5th grade in Fairport.
Gotcha.
And so the class was literature. So I'm asking them this day about point of view. The book was, my name is Sam, which was a Revolutionary War story. So I said to them, Andy in particular, how do you know it's the point of view? How do you know that, who it is? He says to me, because he took me with him.
Because
He took me with him.
he took me with him in the book.
Yeah,
That's really profound.
I know. I said, maybe I should go back to 4th, I don't know.
He took me with him, yeah.
And these guys that you're talking about, they're taking us with them. That's what I was thinking about.
And conversely, we're taking them with us as we deal with contemporary problems. You think I got a problem?
You have many problems.
Well, I do. I'm trying to get help, so. Ask the sisters who are watching, they'll know.
Forgot about that. Sorry.
One of my friends, I do a communion service every Thursday at the Mother House when it isn't a holy day and they have to have a priest. No offense. But anyway, one of Sister Raymond Joseph, and I'm short, but she's like this, and she has a wheelchair that's automatic, and with the Bills game, she will ride that chair down to the dining room with a big Bills sign on the front, and you know. And so she's 99. And she said, you know, Barbara, I'm going to be 100 on Super Bowl day. And I said, well, I'll be there. You better be, because I'm aiming for the same thing. She's just an amazing, amazing person. Yeah. So right after these first 8 verses, right after that first chapter in Mark, this is what the next verse is. Verse 9. And in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. So right away, we're right into the ministry of Jesus. It's a great gospel, full of energy. And there's something that scholars say in Mark's gospel. The disciples and apostles ask Jesus, and he'll say, don't talk about it now. And they call it the Markan secret. Don't talk about it now until after the resurrection. So it's just wonderful. So, any question at this point? Because now I'm going to turn to you all. How might the context of Mark's community speak to our own? We talked about that context. I'll let that just settle, and don't say you got anything else. How might this context, Mark's gospel, speak to our own day? I'll start. I'll start. What are we watching throughout our world that Mark saw in a smaller geographic area of Rome at that time. The persecution and conflict over beliefs. Israel
Yes,
and Palestine.
it doesn't stop.
Struggles over beliefs, and how one group of extremists are fanning the fire. Nero fanned it. One group of extremists, Hamas. We're seeing, like Rome, powerful nations trying to control smaller nations. That's what Russia is doing in the Ukraine. That's what Russia is doing in the Ukraine. And if they succeed, it could be difficult. Neighbors at war. Violence was common. In the original October 7th disaster, when Hamas entered into the West Bank, the violence toward women, and we're still seeing it, the violence toward women.
And children.
And children. The cross, I think this day, today, is being replaced by gun violence. By gun violence. And that tool is open to many. I mean, average people didn't go about crucifying their neighbors. You had to have the equipment and the power. But today, just somebody who didn't get a job at a university kills. The other thing that I think Mark tells us right in the very beginning is the importance of the desert. That's where Jesus started. The figurative deserts in our lives, and you and I have all experienced those dry moments, those isolated moments, those moments when we have been so hurt. We've experienced them. And you'll notice that John the Baptist folks came to him. He didn't go to them. Jesus did it differently. He went to the people. And I think at this moment in our history, it's very important for each one of us, no matter what our lifestyle, to retreat now and again to a desert place. That could be a favorite chair. That could be a little spirituality center. That could be 5 minutes in the morning reading something that makes sense. To retreat, to put things in perspective. I used to act quickly and made huge mistakes. I try now to take my time. Take my time, or go to my chair and think the thing through. We all need those desert places. We might ask ourselves, who are the voices like John the Baptist that are calling us to our better selves? Who are those voices? Little Sister Raymond Joseph, 99, calls me to my better self. Sister Rachel in the back of chapel at communion service. Any sister who comes into the mother house, like I did with fractured pelvis, she goes right away and does their laundry twice a week. They're calling us to our better selves. And I love the honesty of John the Baptist as that gospel unfolds. He knew who he was. And he was not swept away by the crowds that came to him. There is a new book that I wanted to share with you that I heard this man interviewed on one of MSNBC. And his name is Tim Alberta. Have you heard of this at all? And the book is called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And he is writing that he's the son of a minister, that the evangelical Christians are perhaps the most polarizing and least understood people living in America. In this book, a practicing Christian, he paints an expansive and powerfully troubling portrait of the American evangelical movement. Through the eyes of televangelists and small-town preachers and celebrity revivalists and everyday church-goers, Alberta tells the story of a faith cheapened by fear, promise, corrupted by partisan subterfuge, and a reputation stained by perpetual scandal. He's laying it right out there. And that's, I think, one of the issues that the church needs to look at this moment in time. There's so much, isn't there? Tell me what you're thinking.
It's also makes so much sense. Like in our world now, we're facing the same things that they did back then.
That's right.
And it's maybe has a different label, but people were people back then just like now.
That's right. It's and you can imagine what the Gospel of Mark meant to people going through persecution. The infancy narratives were pleased that we just want to know what he said, what he did, and that he rose. That was their great security. But times don't change very much, do they?
So one thing that we haven't talked about, and maybe we haven't, I missed it, is the media influence.
Yes. The media.
There's nothing that you don't know. It's there.
Yes. The media influence, and they didn't have that. Everything was an oral story. I'm sure they had their rumors.
Sure they did.
And their lies, like we do today. And their attempt to disgrace people, like we do today. But now we have the media as a very strong tool.
Incessant.
Incessant. Yeah, it's incessant. And we don't listen to each other. Can you imagine someone going to Nero saying, you know, I really wouldn't persecute all these Christians if I were you? Well, the next day he and his family.
There wouldn't be a next day.
There wouldn't be a next day. So I offer you this presentation about Mark. First Gospel, written in Rome, the voice of Peter, and knowing that he's writing to a church that is persecuted. And he's a good companion for us, short and to the point companion.
Is it assumed there was only one author? In other words,
Assumed one author,
yeah. And it was Mark.
It was Mark. But Mark who? Mark Schultz? I don't know.
Yeah, you don't really.
Yeah.
And but why would there be? I mean, obviously, when you say written in those days, wasn't most of it oral histories,
Yes.
more or less being passed around?
Yes. But somebody.
Someone obviously had to record it.
Yeah. And we also know when the monks did their recording in the Middle Ages, they took a little liberty sometimes.
Sure.
But the early Gospels, they were a stream of thought. They weren't broken into chapters and etc. So the monks did that. So you have to say, but one Mark, Luke and John. But the differences that you'll see in the gospel parallels happen because of the context in which they were writing. Luke to Gentiles, Matthew to Jews. It's fascinating.
He also said that he wrote in Greek.
Yes.
So that thought's going through my mind that probably most of the community would not have been able to read Greek.
Read it, right.
Why wouldn't he have taken a different route and at least the native language? Why wouldn't he have recorded it that way?
Like in Latin,
Latin or even
Aramaic.
yeah.
Well, because he was, what I believe is, what I read, Latin was not quite as popular at that time. Most people were not literate. And I think he probably went for the one that most Gentiles, for example, would understand. But still, many people relied on Mark being read to them, oral stories. So next week, God willing, we are going to take a look at the infancy narratives. Matthew, Luke, and there is an infancy narrative in John that I will secretly reveal to you at no extra cost. But it is.
Search for it.
There you go and search for it. And then the last week, I'd like to really put a little emphasis on Mary. Elizabeth Johnson, Sister St. Joseph, has written a book called Friends and Prophets of God. And one of the chapters in the book is about Mary as a friend and prophet, and it's stunningly beautiful. So we'll look at her at the end. Okay, any other question? Listen, I thank you for making the time to come. I thank you all. John, the check is in the mail. And all the people who watched online. We had a good crowd today.